بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد خاتم النبيين وعلى آله الطاهرين وصحابته أجمعين والتابعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So we were in our introduction to Arabic grammar and we finally finished the chapter of Al-Marfu'at, and now we're moving on to the next chapter, and that is the chapter of Al-Majrurat. So those words that are going to be in the jar case. So I mentioned before going into the chapter of Al-Marfu'at that there are 4 different states that a word in Arabic can be in. So I mentioned one of those states is Ar-Raf'u, which is all those words that we've just gone through right now. And then I said An-Nasbu, and then I said Al-Jarru, and then I said Al-Jazmu. So the Nasb case, the Jar case, and the Jazm case. And I mentioned that all those states can be identified with different signs. So Rafa' is normally identified with a Dhamma, and the Nasb case is normally identified with a Fatha, and the Jar case is normally identified with a kasrah, and the Jazm case is identified with a sukoon. So now we're in the chapter of Al-Majrurat, those words that are going to be in the Jar case. So normally and most commonly identified, these words will most commonly and normally be identified with a kasrah. Okay, so the chapter of Al-Majrurat, so the author here, he's given 2 sections to it. So he has Al-Mudaf ilayh, and he has Al-Majrur biharf al-jar. What do those 2 mean? Because he mentions Al-Mudaf ilayh, Al-Majrur biharf al-jar. What do they mean? So the first one is what we're going to go into right now, and it's Al-Mudaf ilayh, and that means that that word that has something brought and connected and attributed to it. That's what that means, like linguistically. Al-Mudaf ilayh, the thing that has something attributed to it. So just quickly, I want to give you an example. Now if someone wanted to make a possessed and possessor in English, in the English language, then you'd say, for example, you'd say Zayd's book, or you'd say the book of Zayd, and that's the better example to give because it fits the layout properly. So the book of Zayd. So now you have this concept in language where if you want to give the meaning of possession of an item or something or someone to a person, then there's different ways you can do it. So in English, as you can see, all I had to do was put an S to the end of Zayd, and that's it. It gives the meaning of possession. Zayd's book. So now we know the book belongs to Zayd. Or you can say the book of Zayd, and you add that of in there, and now that gives the meaning of possession. So now you know the book belongs to Zayd. So now how do you do that in Arabic? So in Arabic, when you want to do that, when you want to give the meaning of possession, so if you want to say the book of Zayd in Arabic, or if you want to say my book, your book, his book, how would you go about doing that in Arabic? So there's different ways you can do this, but the most common way you could do this is by using the mudaf and mudaf ilayh layout. And that basically means that you have the word that you're attributing it to someone, and then you have the word that the thing is being attributed to. So for example, if I want to say Zayd's book, you say kitabu with a dhamma on the kitabu, Zaydin with a kasrah. So Zaydin, Zayd has a kasrah. So now here you can see that I've said kitabu Zaydin. I've given the possessed and the possessor layout in Arabic. So I've given the meaning of possession, and I used the layout of mudaf and al-mudaf ilayh. Mudaf and mudaf ilayh. So now the first word will be the mudaf, because that's the word you're attributing to the thing that you're attributing it to. So when you say kitabu Zaydin, you're attributing and you're giving the meaning of kitab, and you're making the possessor of that kitab Zayd. So you're attributing the kitab, which is the book, you're attributing the book to Zayd, and then Zayd will be the mudaf ilayh, the thing that you're attributing, the word that you're attributing to. So that's what al-mudaf ilayh is. So in the mudaf ilayh structure, the word that is known as al-mudaf ilayh, which is the second word, which is the word that you're attributing the thing to, that word will be in the jar case. And it will always be in the jar case. Okay, so that's why he's brought it here in the chapter of al-majrurat. He mentions al-mudafu ilayh, meaning that word that in the mudaf ilayh structure, you attribute the thing to that word. So al-mudafu ilayh will always be in the jar case. So again, the mudaf ilayh, mudaf will always be the first one, and the mudaf ilayh will always be the second one. And you know now from this chapter that mudaf ilayh, which is the second word of this possessive structure, will always be in the jar case. So you say kitabu Zaydin, the book of Zayd. So Zayd will be in the jar case, and it will always be in the jar case. And we can recognize the jar case with the word Zayd by seeing that it has two kasras beneath it. Kitabu Zaydin. If I want to say kitabu Amrin, the book of Zayd, such as the book of Amr. Kitabu Amrin, the book of Amr. You can see that Amr is al-mudaf ilayh, and it's in the jar case, therefore it has two kasras beneath it. Kitabu Amrin. If I want to say Kitabu Rajulin, the book of a man. So the book of a man. Then you can see here that Rajul, which is the mudaf ilayh, Kitabu Rajulin, because I've attributed the book to the man or to a man, it's going to be in the jar case. Therefore it has two kasras on it. Kitabu Rajulin. Okay. And then he mentions al-majrur bi harf al-jar, which we're going to go into. We're going to first go over the small rules that come in regards to the chapter of al-mudaf ilayh. So he mentioned that this possessive structure, it exists in Arabic, the structure of mudaf and mudaf ilayh. Now the possessed item and the possessor of the item. Okay, and you always bring the possessed item before the one who possesses it. So you say kitabu Zaydin. If you want to say my book, you say kitabi. So the pronoun that means my will come after the possessed item. So you say kitabi. You say kitabuhu, his book. So you bring the pronoun that means his after the word kitab, which is the possessed item. So the possessor of the item will always come after the possessed item. So the possessed item, the item that is possessed, will come before it always. And that is the chapter of al-mudaf ilayh. One thing to mention is that the author here, he mentions, and I'm not going to read the Urdu, but I'm just going to mention what he's saying here. And then he mentions here that there's a few more extra attachments to this structure that we need to mention. So for example, we mentioned that kitabu Zaydin, that's the structure of mudaf and mudaf ilayh. But he mentions a few more things in regards to mudaf. And he mentions here that the mudaf, which is the possessed item. So in the example of kitabu Zaydin, the mudaf is kitab, which is the item that is possessed, meaning the item that's owned. The word kitab is the mudaf, and he mentions that mudaf will never have alif lam on it, and it will never have tanween on it. So it will either have a single fatha, a single dhamma, and a single kasrah, the mudaf, so the first word of this structure. And in the example of kitabu Zaydin, we're talking about the word kitab. Kitab, in this example, it will never have alif lam on it. So you can't say al-kitabu Zaydin. You can't say that. You have to say it without the alif lam. And you can't say kitabun zaydin, because you can only have one haraka. So you can only have one dhamma, one fatha, and one kasrah. And that's usually how you spot it. Because you see a word, it only has one fatha, or one dhamma, or one kasrah, and it doesn't even have alif lam on it. That's the biggest giveaway that the word you're looking at is a mudaf. And now you know, after like understanding a word is mudaf, you now know that the word after is mudaf ilay. So it's a cheat code. So you know the mudaf, therefore you know the mudaf ilay. Okay, so that's what he's mentioned about the first word of the structure. So kitabu zaydin, the first word is mudaf, right? And we just established that the mudaf, the first word, which is kitab, the first word of the structure, which is kitab, it will not have an alif lam, and it will never have a double haraka. So it will never have two dhammas, and it will never have two fathas, and it will never have two kasras. So you'll never say kitaban zaydin, you'll never say kitabun zaydin, and you'll never ever say kitabin zaydin. It's always kitaba zaydin, kitabu zaydin, kitabi zaydin, depending on what the case of that word kitab is. And then he's also going to mention that the mudaf ilay, so the second word of this specific structure, this mudaf ilay structure, the second word of this structure, the haraka will never, so the state of that word will never ever change. So he mentioned the example, kitabu zaydin. So kitab is mudaf. So now he's talking about the mudaf ilay. And he mentions that for the mudaf ilay, which in that example is Zayd, so kitabu zaydin, which is the second word, that's the mudaf ilay. So the second word is mudaf ilay, which is Zayd in the example of kitabu zaydin. Zayd is mudaf ilay. And he mentions about mudaf ilay that it will never ever change states, ever. And that the first word can. That's the difference between the first word. And that's the difference between the mudaf and the mudaf ilay. So he mentions that Zayd, which is the mudaf ilay, in the example of kitabu zaydin, it will never ever change states. So it's always going to be in the jar case. So it doesn't matter whether you say fi kitabi zaydin, it doesn't matter if you say jaa kitabu zaydin, ra'aytu kitaba zaydin, marartu bi kitabi zaydin. You can see that the only word here that the state will change for is the first word and never the second word. The second word, which is the mudaf ilay, the state will never change no matter what comes before the structure. So if you say ala kitabi zaydin, it's always going to be zaydin. It will never change. And it will never change from the jar case. The mudaf ilay, which is the second word of the mudaf ilay structure, the second word will never ever change from its jar case. It will always be in the jar case. And the word of that structure that will accept changes in its state is the mudaf, the first word, which is kitab. So you'll say kitabu, kitaba, kitabi, you can say that. But you can't say zaydun, zaydan, or zaydin. You can't say zaydun or zaydan. You have to say zaydin for the second word, for the person who possesses the item. He has to. And this thing that possesses the item, it has to be in the jar case and it has to remain in there. And that is what the author mentions about al-mudaf ilayh. And then to finish off this chapter, he talks about al-majroor biharfil jar. And this is another chapter where the author brings a bunch of huruf, a lot of particles. With this chapter, there's a lot of particles involved. So this is the chapter of al-majroor biharfil jar. And what does that mean? What does al-majroor biharfil jar mean? Majroor means that word which is in the jar state. That's what majroor means. And biharfil jar means due to a harf of jar coming, a particle of jar coming. So we have many different particles in Arabic. So some particles put words into the nasb case. And some particles put words into the jazm case. And now we're looking at particles that put words in the jar case, which is why it's in the chapter of al-majrurat, because the word that comes after this particle will be in the jar case. So again, this is the chapter where we're talking about all the particles in this chapter of al-majrur biharf al-jar, they always make the word after it be in the jar case, and they force the word after it. These specific particles in Arabic, they force the word after it to be in the jar case, and they are 17 huruf. And the author, he lists them here, and he says the huruf are bi, ta, ka, li, wa, mudh, mundhu, rubba, hasha, min, ada, fi, an, ala, hatta, ila, khala. And one thing to mention is wa. The wa here, everyone commonly knows the word wa, like when wow comes in or in a sentence, it means and. But the author here, when he brings this wow into this chapter, he's talking about a different wow that has a different meaning. And one thing to mention in Arabic is that a letter and a particle can have many different meanings. So for example, this wow, it can mean and it can also mean wallahi. And it means an oath, that you say wallahi. And you can see that this wow, when you put it with the name Allah, it makes it go into the jar case. So you say wallahi. So you see by Allah, and I swear by Allah. When you say wallahi, that means I swear by Allah. By Allah. And you can see that when you bring this specific wow and you put it next to Allah's name, it makes Allah go, the name of Allah, it makes it go from the rafa' case to the jar case. So you don't say wallahu, you say wallahi. And this is that wow that's part of this chapter. But then the wow that means and is not part of this chapter. And the wow that means and, it does not change the case of the word that it comes with. It just follows whatever case that was already there. Okay, so this chapter is, it has 17 particles. So B, which is just a ba. So, and then you have ta, which is a ta, a kaf, which is a kaf, lam, which is a lam. It has wa, which is a waw. Mudh, mundhu, rubba, hasha, min, ada, fi, an, ala, hatta, ila, khala. So again, I'm not going to translate every single one, but I'll give a few examples. So now, I've explained now that these huruf, these particles, when they come, then they make the word that's directly after them, and they make the word that's directly after them go into the jar case, and they force the word that's directly after them to go into the jar case. And as I said earlier, that the jar case is commonly recognized by a kasrah. So if you see a kasrah on there, that's most likely going to be in the, and that's going to be in the jar case. Okay. So if I say marartu bi Zaydin, that means I passed by Zayd. So I'm giving you an example of the first harf. So the first harf is B. When you add a B to a word, it's going to make it be in the jar case. It's going to force the word after the B to be in the jar case. So if I say marartu bi Zaydin, marartu bi Zaydin, I walked past, or I passed by Zayd. So marartu, mim ra ra ta. Marartu means I passed by. Bi Zaydin, by Zayd. So marartu, I passed. Bi Zaydin, by Zayd. So B, the B here is a harf of jar, meaning it's a particle of jar, which means that the word that comes directly after this particle, which is B, will be in the jar case, which is commonly recognized by a kasrah. So you say marartu bi Zaydin. You don't say marartu bi Zaydun or bi Zaydan. You say marartu bi Zaydin. And that's an example of ba. An example of ta is that when the Arabs commonly say, they say tallahi, and the ta here that's mentioned, it's a ta, the ta that makes the next word be in the jar case. It's the ta that means oath, similar to the wow that we mentioned earlier. So ta, if you say tallahi, لَتُسْأَلُنَّ. So tallahi, you bring a ta, and this ta is a harf of jar, meaning it makes the word directly after it go into the jar case, which is commonly recognized by a kasrah. And the word that comes after the ta is Allah. So it makes the word Allah go from the rafa' case to the jar case. So you don't say tallahu, you say tallahi, and this only works if it's an oath. Otherwise the ta is not used as a harf. It's only used as a harf if it's an oath. Okay. And then you have ka, and that just means, and ka means similar to. So for example, if I say, you laugh like Zayd, or for example, when Imam Ibn Malik mentions so many times in his Alfiya, and he says, oh yeah, this is the rule, and then he'll mention the word, and he'll say, ka Zaydin, or ka Zaydin qa'imin. So for example, when you say ka, it means similar to. So for example, if I say, this is the rule for grammar, ka Zaydin qa'imin, this is the rule of grammar, like the example of Zaydin qa'imin. And you can see that Zaydin qa'imin, it goes into the jar case. Why? Because ka came on it. Because you would have said Zaydun qa'imun, but because of ka, you say ka Zaydin qa'imin. Okay. And those are the three examples that I want to give. And this is the chapter of al-majrur biharf al-jar. Those words that are forced and made to be in the jar case. Why? Because of a particle of jar coming before it. And this is the chapter of al-majrur biharf al-jar. And we went through the chapter of al-mudaf ilayh also. Any mistake I made, any mistake was from me and shaitan, and Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam are both free from it. Subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.